Sure. Well, I don't mind going first or going second. I mean, I don't know which position Christian metaphysics or pagan
Yeah,
metaphysics would be considered the
probably.
default. I would assume Christian metaphysics would be kind of the default. Um, so, would you prefer to begin by sort of stating that
Just
and establishing that baseline, or do you want me to begin as the sort of challenger?
it might be helpful if you start, just because I'm not in. When you say paganism, there's like a lot of pagan beliefs, so I'm not entirely sure what you mean per se.
Sure,
So
that
it
makes
might be
sense.
better if you start, just so I know what exactly you believe different things.
Cool. So I'll run through a little like 5 minute kind of opening remarks to sort of set the tone. So um, we'll just begin and kind of go casually from there. So in a debate between Christian metaphysics and pagan
Yeah,
metaphysics, um, we have to sort of begin by establishing what metaphysics is, right? So metaphysics, as I understand it, I mean, there's the technical sense in which it's just everything after physics and Aristotle, but it is essentially, as far as I can tell, the study of first principles and of foundational beliefs and ideas within philosophy. So the essential metaphysical question would be sort of what is the world made of? Now, it's not the only metaphysical question, obviously, but it's one of the big ones. Is it matter primarily, and if so, what kind? Is it fire or water? If you're Heraclitus or Thales of Miletus, or is it mind? Are we Platonists? I believe that mind is primordial, and maybe most importantly, how can we know these things? Um, a lot of discussion of metaphysics begins with a kind of a priori distrust of the senses. We get this a little bit with Plato, much more so with Descartes and with Immanuel Kant. And this is not um, a rejection of the senses outright, but it highlights the dissatisfaction with the level of certainty that the senses provide. So when these philosophers speak of metaphysics, they're really looking for some kind of certainty, some kind of foundational belief that can provide a base of certainty that they can build an edifice of knowledge on top of. I believe that Christianity sort of follows in the school of Platonism and in many ways precedes uh, Kantian transcendentalism and Cartesian, uh, this sort of precedence of mind and of reason and of the what it boils down to is the word. Um, Now, there's a problem with metaphysics as it's been done for most of the past 2,000 years or 2,300 years. So far as I can tell, all these principles are laid out by means of language. They're laid out in statements. Now, our language is pretty good at describing the world, but the mapping is always imperfect, is always incomplete. The words we use to describe never perfectly capture the things that they are um, pointing to. Now, for ordinary conversation, that's not a problem, you know. But the imperfection of language becomes a problem when we are seeking certainty, when we are seeking absolute truth and principles that govern the entire universe absolutely, such that we can build foundations off of. So, language does not appear to be a suitable means for the pursuit and study of metaphysics. Um, and unfortunately, in addition to much of non Christian philosophy, Christianity seems to fall into this trap of pursuing metaphysics by means of language, specifically by use of the word and the logos, the idea of the logos. I don't know if you're going to present a sort of transcendental argument for God here. I know that's popular in some circles and less so in others. Um, but the metaphysics of language as a if not the primordial ground of being, then at least as a reliable mechanism of reaching that ground of being, seems to be critical to Christianity. And depending on where we go, I might argue later that our very conception of God might be a linguistic illusion as well. So what is the pagan alternative? The pagan alternative is something that might have been present prior to Platonism, and which we see in the school of thought called phenomenology, which begins with perception, and it basically forgoes the desire for certainty, but that doesn't mean that we can't have confidence. We can observe the world and begin with our observation and our participation in the world as a tool of observation. And part of that observation includes the observation that some of our perceptions aren't completely and absolutely reliable. So we have to do our best with approximations. But this uncertainty can serve as a kind of a basic foundation for an epistemology. And perception and participation as means of touching the world, means of sensing and understanding the world, take on primordial significance in how we go about acquiring knowledge and making better decisions in our lives. I think, does that lay out the position sufficiently for you to lay out a counter position?
Yeah, sure, I can. Yeah, I think I can work with that for the most part.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, my argument basically for specifically the Christian gods, as you said earlier, is basically labeled as the transcendental argument or tag, and basically what we say is that reality, like when you talk about metaphysics, you can almost deduce it into two levels of categories. So you have things like, for example, I'd put things in level. Let's call them level 1 and level 2, right?
Okay.
In level 1, you have the basics of being able to understand reality. Like, for example, the presuppositions that words have meaning, that the laws of logic exist, right? Like stuff like that. And then in level 2, you would have stuff like sense data, like the grass is green, the sky is blue. I can hear the horse running, right? Like things that we observe with the senses. And for the senses, right? Well, even like the sun is hot, you have to presuppose level 1 in order to have level 2. Like, unless you presuppose that your senses are reliable and that you can perceive things accurately and everything's not an illusion, you can't actually have level 2. So before you get to sense data, before you get to things like science, physics, geology, all these different things, you have to first of all have an epistemology to justify how you know all these things. And so we say that the mind of God, just the one God, grounds all of these principles and all of these categories. And so the mind of God gives a justification for the existence of these things. And under other worldviews, I don't see any justification for the existence of things like laws of logic. How do you justify the laws of logic existing? Or where are they? Like, where do they come from? What are they? Where are these laws? How do they affect us? How could you justify these? And my biggest issue with paganism would be some of the ideas that they don't really have. Like, for example, if I want to have an epistemology that can justify all of these things, I would have to start by asking, what is paganism, right? Are we talking about the tribal pagans in Africa and the Middle East? Are we talking about the imperial pagans like the Romans who fought against the tribal pagans? Right? I mean, what is where do we get our ethics from? Like, do we follow the Mayans and sacrifice people to the sun, right? Do we how do we know which pagans have it correct? And basically, to be a pagan, you basically have to become a relativist. You basically have to affirm relativism and saying, "Oh yeah, well you have your truth and I have my truth," And but that doesn't actually, lead. That's not helpful in justifying anything instead of actually obtaining real knowledge. And so relativism is the only way you can actually justify the contradictions and the inconsistencies in paganism. And so if a pagan wants to critique Christianity, then I need to know what your basis and system is that you use to judge Christianity. Like, what are you basing your judgment on us on, right? How you say, when you submit the claim Christianity is not true or that paganism is true, you have to define how you're going to determine what is true, right? And so I would basically, and also I would ask you a few more questions about paganism. Like, for instance, these gods, right? They seem to be, from what I've read in, Greek myths, Hindu scripture, stuff like that. They seem to have very different beliefs. The Greek myths, for instance, tend to imply that the pagan gods have physical bodies and they can be injured and they can have fights and they can beat each other. Right, so they're basically, for what I can understand, they're basically just human beings on steroids. They're basically just powerful humans. Like, what is, and where do these gods come from, right? And wherever they came from, where did the thing that made them come from, right? Like, and what is actually limiting these gods? Like, what is it that stops them from being able to do certain things? What are they under? What are the laws and limitations of these gods? Right. I mean, if you take the Hindu belief is kind of similar to ours in a way, where they basically believe in one God who manifests himself basically in lots of different modes of being, like Krishna, Vishnu, but they're all the same person, which is basically modalism. So it's not quite Christianity, but it kind of is similar in a way. But again, Hinduism doesn't even have a consistent belief. Like, some Hindus believe the gods are literally multiple gods. In fact, they did a survey recently and asked Hindus, how many gods do you believe in one God? And I think 62% of, this is rough estimates, I can't remember exactly, but I think 62% of Hindus believe in one God, and then like 48% believe in multiple gods. So, I mean, they don't even know like what they believe specifically, because there's big disagreements there. So, I mean, if paganism is just relative and there's no actual epistemology to justify their worldview, then I don't see how they have any basis to critique Christianity or any basis to prove that their beliefs are true. And so, yeah, that'd be my opening thoughts.
Okay. Very, very good. Let me respond to your response, beginning sort of at the top and working my way down as best I can. So you were speaking about sort of level one beliefs, as sort of, or beliefs is probably the wrong word, but these sort of basic presuppositions, these ideas that words have meaning, the laws of logic. I would imagine if we are good Cartesians, we would include certain a priori mathematical precepts in here as well. And then level 2, including sense data. And you say, what to me seems rather strange, that level 2 actually requires level 1. That you actually can't make sense of your sense data without these basic presuppositions, these sort of tacit beliefs that inform how we interpret what is coming through our eyes and so forth. I would challenge this. I would challenge this at a very basic level. I don't believe perception requires these basic presuppositions. And in fact, this is an illusion. All of logic, and I opened this argument by pointing out the problematic nature of using language and the imperfections of language in order to explore metaphysics, which is a great problem if you're seeking certainty, but not necessarily a problem if you're seeking a level of confidence. And I think this comes down to another word that you brought up, which is justification. Justification to whom? Or do we have to have some kind of objective justification to other people in order to allow ourselves to have a particular belief? Or is there some other reason that we need to justify our beliefs to other people? Or are we just looking for the best set of beliefs in order to operate in the world? In which case, objective certainty might not be, let alone achievable, might not even be necessary in order to choose a better path. Now, you asked about, I'm sort of jumping around a little bit because I don't want to leave anything unaddressed. Some of these things are easier to address than others. You asked, what standard would you even use to criticize Christianity? What would be the baseline? I would say the standard used to criticize Christianity would be its own standard. That's the only fair standard by which one could, I think, criticize Christianity. To be clear, I don't think Christianity is bad or evil. I think it's good. I think it's got a lot of good things. It carries a lot of very good pagan ideas forward, especially the idea of heroism. But it's incomplete, and it neglects the problems of language, which we see in Homer, for example. You have the Bible is a very Iliadic text. It is very much about the pursuit of immortality through the word, if not through story, then at least in the form of a book of life and in the Logos incarnate. It neglects this sort of the mirror side of this, the Odyssean recognition of the mercurial nature of language, and that it doesn't necessarily do what we think it's going to do, and is in many ways incomplete, which is the point I was bringing up before. And it comes back to these basic presuppositions. One example of a sort of transcendental argument for objective morality, and I hope this will serve as a kind of illustration of the problem here, is that people will say, oh, murder is objectively wrong and always wrong. And this sounds very compelling because it's hard for anyone to think of an example of a civilization or society, no matter how barbaric, where murder is acceptable, where murder is okay. Now, there are many civilizations and societies where certain forms of killing are acceptable. For example, in Exodus, you have Moses explaining how if a thief breaks into your home at night, you can kill him and not incur the blood price. That's okay. If he breaks into your home in the day and you kill him, that's not okay. So we've delineated what is murder, what incurs the blood price, and what is not. But why would we say murder is always wrong when we could say killing is always wrong? When we say murder is always wrong, and when you get down to the details of, okay, what actually distinguishes murder from killing? Because in the United States, at least in particular states, not all states, the rules vary. If a thief breaks into your home, you can kill him even during the daytime. But in other states, even if it's at nighttime, if you kill him, it would be considered murder and not permissible. So the definition of murder varies from state to state. And again, this kind of minor details doesn't get in the way of us being able to communicate with each other in colloquial conversation. But when we try to extrapolate and deduce basic laws of the universe, like objective moral laws exist, that murder is wrong, we have to be very precise. We have to be very technical in what we mean by things like murder, for example. And what murder boils down to is killing that we have agreed is wrong. So the entire exercise is circular, but it's so easy to miss. It's easy to fail to see that we have just tricked ourselves with language by defining certain kinds of killing as murder, and then saying the things that we have defined as wrong are always wrong because we define them that way, and therefore, look, we have an example of objective moral truths. And much of objective beliefs in general are like this. So I have to challenge the level one idea, not just the rules themselves. Words have meaning. They do when we give them meaning. I would also challenge the laws of logic as existing apart from presuppositions and axioms which are themselves not logical and are not rational necessarily. This is just Gödel's incompleteness theorem applied to language. But But I would also challenge the idea that these presuppositions, which are linguistic in their nature, are required for our sense data to be meaningful. And this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning with the problem with language and doing metaphysics by means of language. You can just look outside of the human species to other animals, mammals, and birds in particular, which are not linguistic in the manner that humans are. They don't appear to have metaphysical statements in their vocabulary, and they can sense things very accurately. And you can say, well, they have tacit presuppositions. Well, but they don't need those to be explicit in order to act in the world well. And if you don't mean explicit presuppositions, but these sorts of tacit presuppositions, then we could have a conversation about what the precise nature of these tacit presuppositions are, which we express in language but are not linguistic necessarily. But I think when we understand the problem with language, the problem of language as it applies to grand metaphysical deductions about being and about the universe, everything else breaks down in terms of justification to whom and the standard that Christianity offers in terms of rationally justifying itself to the world. And I think this ties into your question about paganism. I'll try to close up briefly here because I've been going on for a bit. Yes, all of these different pagan beliefs are different. They are different from each other. Oftentimes they are different even from themselves across different time. That's because they are not seeking rational consistency with a coherence model of truth that requires explicit linguistic coherence. They're rather beginning with a participatory and observant relationship with the world, with a phenomenological relationship with the world that can sometimes be hard to explain, but is very, very functional in practice. And again, this is largely, I think, a debate about the challenge with language and what pagan societies that appear to contradict themselves and yet survived for a great deal of time and quite comfortably and happily, I think have demonstrated, is the not just insufficiency, but the unnecessary nature of this kind of linguistic coherence that people believe is required in order to have their beliefs to be justified without necessarily clarifying to whom they need to justify their beliefs.
Hello, Austin. Just thought I'd chuck that in there. Good to see you, man.
Yo, what's up, bro? How are you?
Yeah, well, man, are you and CB talking, are you? Or is CB just in here doing a monologue to himself? He's just like...
Nah, we're talking... we're talking about Christianity and paganism.
Yeah, Austin gave a quite a good monologue himself.
I missed the Austin monologue and I showed up for the CB radio monologue.
Well,
should be CB radio.
We're about to hear another Austin monologue. I hope I've been...
Do you mind if I just quickly interject and like kind of ask what you two are talking about? Because I intend to stick around for a minute. I'm not like jumping off.
No, we're happy to have you. We arranged a debate on Christian metaphysics versus pagan metaphysics. I sort of began with an explication of the problem of language and the problem.
I believe I've seen you before, CB. Have you been on YouTube on people's channels?
I debated Jay Dyer a couple years back. I
remember that. Is that the one that sounds like it's literally on a fucking cassette?
Yes,
from the 80s.
Yes, that was.
I remember achieving migraine. I know you might call it gnosis, right, in the pagan tradition. I achieved what might be called migraine listening to that. From the like noises coming over. It's fucking awful. But I did listen to that. You were really polite. I actually really enjoyed listening to that.
Well, I appreciate that. I've had a bit of time to develop my thoughts since then because. I love listening to Jay Dyer because I think he does a very good job pointing out problems. I don't agree with his adversarial approach to truth, but I understand it and respect it.
But I think from that debate, that was certainly a more formal sounding one. And like I said, I think great behaviour in that. Minus the ear piercing tones running in the background from. It sound like it being recorded off a gramophone or something.
Right. But
It's great.
I think we're both impeding on Austin's chance to respond.
Yeah, sorry, Austin.
No, don't worry, it's fine. Actually, I think I've seen that debate with Jada as well. I didn't realize that was you in the video, but yeah, I think I did watch
You're
that.
famous, TV. You're famous.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, I'm trying to remember what you said now. Yeah. So you kind of said, okay, you said about do words have meaning? I mean, the thing is that you're kind of, I mean, in our view, right? We don't just like when we look at the Bible, right? Because that's where we get now. Like, I'm assuming that's what when you say words like how do we know what they mean and stuff like that. I'm assuming you mean how do we know what the Bible's saying? Well, because the thing is with the Bible, right? We
I was speaking of language more generally, but
more generally. Okay.
but it would apply to the Bible as well.
Well, if you're talking in a more genuine sense, then I'm not sure that's really much of an issue because like we understand what each other are saying right now. So in the fact that words may or may not have meaning, like I know what you're saying from a technical point of view. How do we know they have meaning? But like in a practical sense, I don't think that really either matters to either of us because like we both understand what each other are saying right now. So
of course, yes.
I don't think that's really much of an issue. The ethics part, I mean. You kind of more went on it from a point of human laws are subjective, like what's murder and what is in different states in America have different views. Yeah, but the thing is, we don't base our morals on the United States of America. Like our morals are clearly grounded in the Bible, so we go off
I drew my
what
example from Exodus, not from American law.
So what did you? Okay, I might have forgotten that part. What did you say about Exodus exactly?
It was the part where in the code, I believe it's Exodus. It might have been Deuteronomy, where Moses is outlining. Well, first there's the Decalogue. It says, "Thou shalt not commit murder," but we have this passage, and I'd have to go back and find the precise passage where they say, "If a thief breaks into your home in the nighttime, and you kill him, you shall not incur the blood price." In other words, that's not murder.
Yeah.
However, if the thief breaks into your home during the day and you kill him, that is murder and will incur a blood price. So
those damn day feet.
Right. So like, but my point is there were like you can say, well, because this comes from Moses, it has special divine sanction. But if we step back from the Christian frame for a second and speak descriptively about how murder has been distinguished from other kinds of killing across time, there are always differences in the rules. Every society has had prohibitions on the wrong kinds of killing, right? You're not allowed to just kill someone on the street. However, where the line is between justified killing and unjustified killing varies from society to society. And so what emerges from this larger frame, from this descriptive observation of society, of human society as a whole, is that murder is actually a linguistic category that means killing which is wrong. And it is very hard to find when we're speaking of metaphysics, of these kind of first principles that we can point to as objective, universal truths of existence. It is hard to find and point to things that are always true of a moral nature that are not just linguistic categories like that.
Okay, well, I don't really. I mean, yeah, you could. I mean, you could call it that, but I mean, yeah. So we don't really. I don't really see why that's specifically an issue because I mean, like in our worldview, our ethics are based on the divine. Because if we're basing our like actual morals, we can't actually. I mean, as you know, the famous problem: you can't get an ought from an is, right? So you can't, because something is a certain way doesn't mean you ought to do something, right?
Right.
So just because someone killed someone doesn't mean you ought to do something about it. So that's why we don't get our oughts. We get our oughts from an is. We get our oughts from the command, right? We have the divine command where God says this is right and this is wrong, right? And we just accept that. We don't try and say, oh well, in this scenario, what should we do here? Let's get an ought here. We don't do that.
Yeah.
We just base everything of what is right and wrong on the divine command.
Okay.
So we don't.
So
we don't really miss that issue.
So it sounds like we're shifting then from a sort of moral metaphysics, which I sort of brought up, into a more physical metaphysics of what is real. Because, I mean, the divine injunctions to follow God's laws are sort of contingent on God's existence. And you mentioned...
Everything's contingent on God's existence.
Right. And so the argument I sort of alluded to but didn't make, but so we might get to, I think might be coming up, which is the idea that God himself, our conceptualization of God as this grounding for being, akin to the laws of logic itself, is himself a linguistic construct of this kind. And so the preliminary priming I want to give is the idea that God is supposedly both perfect in his mercy and also perfect in his justice. And this is a known, not contradiction, but paradox, we'll say. A known paradox and perhaps a mystery. How can a being be both perfectly just and perfectly merciful when these two things are clearly logically at odds with each other?
Well,
And
I think
if we set aside the contradiction for a moment, what emerges, the common denominator between these two things, is perfection itself. And I don't think God would even be conceivable to the sort of mind that sees God as necessary at this metaphysical level. God is perfection. That's the conceptualization. But perfection does not exist in the world. Perfection, as a word, is a description of an experience that we have. It's not a quality that an object possesses, but rather is something we perceive and ascribe to an object upon perceiving it in a particular way. And so, again, this sort of linguistic, our language can trick us into believing something is real because we ascribe it as a category to things outside of the word. But all we are actually doing is describing a word.
Yeah, sure. I think Billy wanted to say something, so I'll let him say it, and then I'll go after that.
Sure.
Yeah, all I was going to say is that, like, this kind of naive, and that's not to be rude, but just this kind of naive approach, it's kind of, you know, I would think that implicit in every logical epistemic claim is the assumption of a value claim, and I think it almost sounded to me, CB, like you think that ethics, knowledge claims, metaphysics, these are all divorced things that bear their own analyticity, right? Like everybody knows what logic is, or everybody knows what these things are. I just wouldn't be approaching from that, right? Like, I mean, that's relying on the myth of the given.
The myth of the given, could you describe that?
The idea that these things are obvious and self-evident, right? Like you're just kind of appealing to like what you're saying are like.
Oh, no, I didn't mean to imply that. I didn't mean to. I think they genuinely are very tricky, and it's actually very easy to trick ourselves.
Just to give an example, like you say justice and this other thing, you say they're in contradiction. I'm like, well, that just assumes that those terms have an analyticity outside of systems, and I'm saying that, yeah, that they just mean what they mean, right? That like there's like a rigid definition.
Oh, no. I take the opposite view. I'm a fan of Wittgenstein's family resemblance model of language, and that words can mean different things in different contexts depending on the language game being played. And this has caused a lot of confusion of a different kind. So, for example, when we read John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, etc., etc., the word for love there, agape, it does not mean what most English speakers sort of assume it means. It's not phileo, right? Or eros, for that matter, or storge. Agape is something much closer to charity. But the sentence sort of changes its tone and color a little bit if you were to translate it as, for God was so charitable to the world that he gave his one and only Son. These differences in tone and color change a lot of things, and I think the worst example of this is in politics. Because if you hear someone get up and defend democracy in a country of 300 million people, you will have 350 different understandings of what democracy entails or means. There, it's a very intentional abuse of ambiguity of meaning. But I think unintentional abuses of ambiguity can happen as well. And we can even trick ourselves with accidental equivocations from one context where a word means one thing to another context where a word means something else. And this goes back to what I was bringing up at the very beginning with why language itself is an undesirable medium to do metaphysics with. And that metaphysics that begins with observation and participation, as in a idiosyncratic and geographically specific religious tradition, whether that's Shinto or one of the million different subvarieties of Hinduism or something like that, is actually a better metaphysical foundation than a language-based coherence model of truth metaphysical framework.
Well, if I could get in there real quick.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, yeah. I just so to respond to two of those things, really quickly, you made up the thing you mentioned. How can God be all just and also be all merciful or all loving, something like that? That's actually, Saint Athanasius in his book on the Incarnation calls this the divine dilemma, and his response, and this is actually the argument he uses to prove the crucifixion is necessary, by saying that it fulfills both of those things in terms of it's perfectly just because the penalty of sin is death, and therefore, since all have sinned, all deserve to die, and so Jesus taking that death on himself is therefore creates a situation where God has given perfect justice, but it's also perfect mercy because he's taken the punishment away from the persons and given it to himself. Like, for instance, if you had a fine, right? You can't, like, because some people say, oh, why doesn't God just forgive? Well, I can't. Well, if you owe me money, I can just forgive, but I still got to pay the money, right? If you don't pay me my money, that means I've got to lose my money, right? I can't just, like, there's the money doesn't just appear and I can have my money back. If I gave it to you, I can't get it back.
It's justice, but it's somebody who didn't commit a crime being charged of a crime. How does that make sense?
Well, here we get into the trouble with these words, because it is just in one sense and it is not just in another. I subscribe to the belief...
No, I don't think there is a difference. I think things are just or they're not.
Well, then let me ask you,
one
Mr.
thing,
Cardinal, what is justice?
Well, justice in the case of somebody being charged with a crime would be a person being convicted of what they did. So, for example, if Jesus Christ wasn't a sinner, then it's not justice for him to suffer the punishment for those who did sin. He's been falsely accused, right? He's taking the punishment of a sinner, and he's not a sinner. So, for example, if I were to charge you with murder and convict you of murder and sentence you to 10 years in prison for manslaughter or whatever, that wouldn't be justice if you didn't commit the crime. Justice is finding people guilty of what they did.
Is my bringing up the subject of murder and the differences in definitions of murder maybe a little bit more pertinent now that Mr. Cardinal has jumped in and
well, I wonder, it gets into all sorts of views of, like, vicarious atonement, but I was just curious about, like, Austin, like, would you think, like, when we say that God is just, right, we think that there's a similarity, right, between his action of justice and say like our created justice, right? But we don't think it's univocal, right? I wouldn't say it's like univocal predications.
Yeah, I'd say the issue with I mean, I think it is, you can analogize it or analogize it to our justice in a certain sense, in terms of, if I owe you money, I can forgive your debts, right? I can pay the punishment for you, and because we
That's not
owe debt.
justice.
Never,
That's not what justice means.
hang on. We owe debt to God, and so God is paying the debt for us. And actually, well, legally speaking, that does fulfill the legal necessity. And just it's not
paying his
justice.
own debt to that we owe him. That doesn't make any sense.
He's
doesn't make any sense either.
he's using legal language as an analogy. He's not saying it's literally a law court. He's just saying and that's what we're discussing, the analogy of language there.
Well,
Yeah.
So this was originally a debate between me and Austin, but Mr. Cardinal has brought up a good question, and I wonder if I can ask him, Mr. Cardinal, could you describe us what justice is without reference to a specific instance of justice being done?
I don't mean anything. Itself? Yeah, whenever people do that from now on, whenever people beg for definitions, I'm just going to appeal to the definition that comes from the English language and the authority of the Oxford Dictionary. Okay. Right? I don't mean anything outside of what the Oxford Dictionary says. I don't have my own personal definition.
Well, without looking it up, I would imagine that the Oxford Dictionary gives perhaps several definitions of justice. I would bet if I looked it up, it would give 4 or 5.
No, they typically actually don't.
In a conversation about metaphysics, the precise meaning of these things, if we're talking about the objective existence of principles like justice or mercy, matters. And this is something we were going over earlier. Like, the dictionary definition is perfectly sufficient for most uses of most words in colloquial conversations.
No, actually, every single one, not most.
No, because there are instances where the meaning of a word will change based on context. So, for example,
give me an example.
If you're at a stand-up comedy show, a sentence that would mean something else in the context of a political debate might mean something different when delivered as a punchline.
Sure, like what?
Do you actually not understand the principle in question here?
No, I understand fully. I disagree. I don't think that's true at all. So explain your position.
Okay. So let me give an example that isn't comedy then. If I were to describe
I want a comedy example.
If I were to describe to you
I want a comedy example. You just brought up comedy, so let's give me a comedy example.
It's a quick example. If you're not willing to go along with an attempted explanation, it just looks like you're being adversarial and you're not genuinely interested in understanding the point.
Well, no, I didn't ask you to explain it to me so that I can understand. I vehemently disagree. I believe that the definitions of words are conclusive, and there is no arguing outside of definitions.
Negative mean?
I don't believe in personal definitions. No. We're not going to do this. Give me an example and relate it to the comedy show.
Mr. Cardinal, we're not here
because you told me that a comedian. Stop. You told me that a comedian can change the word of a meaning. You can change the definition of a word based on his comedy. I'd like you to explain that to me because I don't agree with that at all.
Okay. For the sake of the argument, then let let the comedian part go, and let me concede.
No, I don't. No, you don't get what I'm saying to you. You don't get what I'm saying to you. You gave me an analogy. You said a comedian can change the definition of a word for the purpose of comedy. I need you to give me an example of that so that I can understand your position. I don't want you to ask me a question sarcastically, ask me for another definition, do whatever running away and squirming you're doing. Give me an example of a comedian. Why did you say that in the first place?
Because comedy is one example of a mode of communication that is different than other modes of communication.
But we're not talking about modes of communication. We're talking about definitions of word and word meaning.
But meanings of words can change based on.
No, they can't. That's my position. They can't.
Yes,
so give me an example of them changing. Okay, I'll let you squirm away and I'll let you off the hook, right? It's like the worm is on you, or you're squirming away. You told me a comedian can change the definition of a word. They can't. So I'll let you squirm away. Tell me how a person can change the definition of a word. Give me any example, not just comedy, any example of how this is
negative. What is the meaning of the word negative?
You're asking me a question. You're not giving me an example.
The question is.
He is giving you an example. If you don't understand,
no, he's not. He asked me a question.
I think you're being adversarial. If you don't understand intuitively that negative
Okay, I'll answer your
mean
question about the negative.
that
I'll answer your question about the
can
negative.
mean
I'll answer your question about the negative.
an inverse
Consistent-
space, the absence of something, or it can mean bad in a
Yeah.
positive sense.
No,
And
no,
both of
you're
those
talking.
senses are
Hold on.
legitimate.
No, I understand that. So
Okay.
now you're talking about something totally different. Now you're talking
No,
about
it's
dual meanings. Stop. Now you're talking about dual meanings. So I never argued that certain words have dual meanings. What I argued was what you said, which is what I think is ridiculous, that a person like a comedian or in politics can just shift and change the word and come up with his own definition. So if society,
The entire
societally,
meaning of
stop
justice
talking.
was
Stop.
changed.
Stop interrupting. No, it hasn't changed. It's a dual meaning. So you said a comedian, for the sake of comedy, at a comedy show, can change the definition of a word to serve as comedy. That's not actually true. The definition of the word doesn't change.
Can we boot
Now you're
Mr.
stop
Cardinal?
talking over
Can we
me.
boot Mr.
Stop.
Cardinal?
Stop over talking me. So now you're saying that certain words have dual
All right, I
meanings.
came
I
here to
totally
debate
agree
Austin.
that certain words have
Mr.
dual
Cardinal
meaning.
does not
I
So
absolutely
we can-
agree.
we can
just
My name's
both
Austin
mute
too. You know what's
Cardinals,
funny
to be
about that?
honest.
That's my name too. You know,
We can both just mute him on our
certain
screen.
words
So
have
fill
dual
up.
meanings. That wasn't what you said. You said a person can just change the meaning at will. That's what I argued with. Not that they have dual meanings. Do you get that, Robertson?
Yes, and they can change the meaning at will.
No, they can't.
Yes, they can.
So you have to explain to me. This is the 7th time I've asked you now how a person can change the meaning, not how certain words have dual meanings. I
By
don't disagree with
asserting
that.
it. It's the
I
easiest thing in
think.
the world.
Let me. Wait.
Okay, so
Wait.
how?
No.
Give me an example of a person who can just
Justice.
change the word.
I
The
think it's
entire
how
history
you
of
worded it.
philosophy was the changing of the meaning of justice.
I think it's how CB
How
worded it.
so?
I mean the interpretation.
How so?
I mean the interpretation of the word, not the actual definition of the word.
No, the definition changes. The definition provided in the
No, it
dictionary
doesn't.
And
changes
now
based
it
on
is
usage.
actually done.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, but that's based on consensus. That doesn't happen on an individual level.
Oh my fucking god! You don't understand the scope of what we're
You don't
doing.
understand anything. You're just talking out of your asshole.
No, Cardinal, you
Give me
came
an
on
example
very
of a
emotional,
person who
so
can
I
just
feel like
change the
I'm
definition of a
I'm
word.
gonna
Please, give me an
ask
example.
you, I'm gonna ask you to leave, but
Give
I'm
me
going
an
to.
example. Don't be an idiot. Give me an example. I've asked you 8 times now to give me an example and explain what you're
yeah, and
saying.
then every time he tries to answer you, you just go into a hissy fit and go, "Oh, give me an example," when you
He
watch
doesn't
the
answer.
report.
He's just trying to
You just run out
Guys,
every
Alright.
time.
Nice chatting.
Cardinal,